The moment Lionel Fletcher rode into Dust Creek, New Mexico territory, in the blazing summer of 1878, he had no intention of falling in love, and he had even less intention of proposing marriage to a woman who had just handed him back his own gift with a look that could have peeled the bark clean off a pine tree. But that is precisely what happened, and the story of how it came to be is one worth telling in full. From the very first morning the sun cracked open over the red mesa cliffs to the evening, when two people stood beneath a sky so thick with stars it seemed like God himself had scattered diamonds across velvet just to bear witness. Dust Creek was not a remarkable town by any stretch of a traveler's imagination. It sat low against the desert floor like a man crouching beneath a weight he had learned to carry, its main street running a single long quarter-mile between a livery stable on the western end and a dry goods store on the eastern end. In between there was Carver's Saloon, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office, a post office that smelled permanently of horse and ink, a church with a steeple that leaned 6 degrees to the south, and the Shelton boarding house, which was the finest establishment in town, which was not saying an awful lot, but said a great deal about the woman who ran it. Beatrice Shelton was 26 years old, tall for a woman of her era. With dark chestnut hair she kept pinned severely at the nape of her neck, except on Sunday mornings, when she allowed herself the small vanity of letting it hang loose to her shoulders. She had green eyes, a slight gap between her two front teeth that she was entirely unapologetic about, and hands that were perpetually chapped from hauling water and scrubbing floors. She had inherited the boarding house 3 years prior from her father, Emmett Shelton, who had died of a fever during a particularly brutal February, leaving her the building, a debt of $40 to the general store, and a reputation for being the most sensible man in Dust Creek, a reputation Beatrice had quietly absorbed and made her own. She ran the boarding house with an economy of motion that impressed everyone who stayed there. She cooked breakfast at 5:30 and supper at 6:30 without variance. She charged a fair price for a clean room, and she did not permit drinking past 10 o'clock at night or any behavior that would make her father's memory uncomfortable. She was not unkind, but she was not soft either. The men who passed through Dust Creek on their way to the silver mines in the mountains, or the cattle drives moving north to the rail towns, learned quickly that Beatrice Shelton's boarding house offered the best biscuits in the territory and the most unforgiving set of house rules outside of a monastery. She had been proposed to twice before Lionel Fletcher arrived, once by a traveling land surveyor named Gerald who had sweaty palms and a nervous laugh, and once by Dale Hutchins, who ran the livery, and who was perfectly decent but who smelled permanently of manure in a way that transcended occupation and seemed to be simply a feature of his character. She had declined both with the same courteous directness that characterized everything she did, and she had not lost a moment's sleep over either decision. She was not looking for a husband. She had a boarding house, a small vegetable garden behind it, a cat named Colonel who was ancient and opinionated, and enough work to fill every hour of daylight. She was content. She told herself this regularly, and she believed it most of the time. Lionel Fletcher arrived on a Tuesday in July, which was relevant because Tuesday was the day Beatrice washed linens, and she was in the yard pulling sheets off the line when she heard the particular sound of a horse that had been ridden a long distance, that slow, rhythmic clop with a hitching quality that came from tired legs and cracked hooves. She looked up from the sheet she was folding. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that men who worked cattle tended to be lean, not thin but stripped of anything unnecessary, broad across the shoulders with forearms tanned so dark they were nearly the color of the saddle leather. He had a jaw that had not seen a razor in about 5 days, dark eyes beneath a battered hat, and an expression that she could not immediately categorize, which was unusual because she was very good at categorizing expressions. He looked tired, yes, But there was something underneath the tiredness that was sharper, more alert, like a man who had been watching the horizon for a long time and had not yet decided whether what was coming was good or bad. He reined his horse, a big sorrel gelding with a blaze down its face, to a stop outside the gate that separated her yard from the street. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, and his voice was deep and carried a southwestern drawl that made his words round at the edges. "I was told this might be a place to find a room." "It might be," she said, finishing the fold on her sheet with a sharp snap that was entirely unconscious. "It depends on whether you can abide by the rules of the house." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not aware of having been given the rules yet. No drinking in the rooms past 10 o'clock, no firearms brought to the table, breakfast at 5:30, supper at 6:30, the pump in the yard is shared, and I expect the rooms left in the same condition they're found." He considered this for a moment. "That seems reasonable." "It is reasonable," she said. $1.50 a week, meals included." He reached into his coat and produced the money without negotiation, which told her several things about him that she filed away quietly. He introduced himself as Lionel Fletcher, lately of the Delaney cattle operation outside of Las Cruces, where he had spent 4 years as a trail foreman before a disagreement with Delaney's eldest son over a matter of wages and honesty had concluded his employment there. She showed him to a room on the second floor at the rear of the house, which looked out over the vegetable garden and caught a good breeze in the evenings. It was a plain room, as all the rooms were, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher, a window with a curtain made from flour sack cotton, and a peg on the wall for hanging things. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had been sleeping on the ground and found it entirely satisfactory. "Supper's at 6:30, she reminded him, and left him to settle. At supper that evening there were 4 other boarders. There was Clarence Mott, who was a telegraph operator with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to hum quietly to himself. There was Patterson, a miner who said very little and ate a great deal. There was Mrs. Ada Whitmore, a widow of 62 who was visiting her son in the next town over and had stopped for 2 nights. And there was Jimmy Driscoll, who was 19 and worked at the general store and who boarded with Beatrice because his own family lived 6 miles outside of town, and the ride was impractical on a daily basis. Lionel Fletcher sat at the end of the table and said polite things when spoken to, and did not speak when he had nothing of value to add, which Beatrice noticed was a quality that was rarer than it ought to be. She served roasted chicken and potatoes and biscuits, and he cleaned his plate with the thoroughness of a man who had missed meals, and when he thanked her he looked directly at her, which was something that Gerald the surveyor had never quite managed. He stayed the second day, and the third. He was looking for work, he said, when she asked him at breakfast on the third morning with the forthright curiosity she applied to all things. Not cattle necessarily, though that was his trade. He had heard there was a rancher named Holt outside of town who was building up a herd and needed experienced hands. "Ed Holt," she said, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "He's a fair enough man. His spread is about 4 miles northwest past the dry wash." "Do you know everyone in this county?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that was not quite teasing but was adjacent to it. "I run a boarding house," she said. "People talk, I listen. It would be foolish not to." He smiled at that, and the smile did something unexpected to the lower regions of her chest, something she attributed to the fact that she had been bending over the stove and the heat sometimes did peculiar things. He rode out to Holt's ranch on Thursday morning and came back in the afternoon with a job that started the following Monday. He would be overseeing Holt's new herd acquisition from the south, which required him to remain in Dust Creek for some weeks while arrangements were finalized, and so he paid Beatrice 2 weeks in advance, which she accepted without comment but with a quietly composed satisfaction. What began then was one of those careful, incremental things that neither party quite acknowledges, while it is happening because the acknowledging of it would require an admission neither is yet prepared to make. He was at the breakfast table every morning at 5:30 without exception, which was a thing she noticed and respected because it was a thing she cared about. He brought the chairs in from the yard one evening when a wind came up before she had gotten to them, without being asked. He fixed the hinge on the gate that had been squeaking for 3 weeks with a small piece of wire he fashioned himself. He did none of these things with any announcement or any apparent expectation of gratitude. He simply did them the way a man does things when he pays attention to his surroundings. She began, without quite deciding to pay attention to him in return. He was from West Texas originally. He told her one evening when they happened to be the last two at the supper table after the others had dispersed. His father had worked cattle his whole life, and his mother had died when he was 12, and after that it had been just the two of them and the land, which was a hard combination that produced a certain kind of man. He had been on his own since 18, which was not unusual for that time and place, and he had worked the drives up to Abilene before the rail lines pushed south and changed the patterns of everything. He had been to Dodge City twice and had no desire to return. He had seen enough of boom towns to know that what they offered was not worth what they cost. She listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and her green eyes steady on his face. And she told him in return that she had come to Dust Creek at the age of 10 with her father after her own mother's death in Missouri, that she had grown up behind the counter of the general store her father worked before he saved enough to buy the building that became the boarding house, that she had taught herself to cook from a book and from trial and error, and that the error years had been genuinely terrible for everyone involved. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and she found herself smiling in return with the kind of ease that she was not accustomed to. "You've been here a long time," he said. "All my adult life," she agreed. "And you're not tempted by elsewhere." She considered the question seriously, which was how she considered all questions. "Sometimes I think about it, but I built something here. It's harder to leave something you built than something you found." He nodded slowly, and she had the feeling that he understood that distinction in a way that went beyond the polite agreement of conversation. The thing that changed between them, the thing that shifted the air in the room whenever they were both in it, happened gradually and then all at once, the way most important things do. It started with the storm. In August, 3 weeks after Lionel had arrived, the sky over the mesa turned the color of a bruise in the late afternoon, and a dry lightning storm came rolling in from the west with the kind of speed that the New Mexico sky specialized in, going from hot and clear to violent in the space of an hour. Beatrice spent the first half of the storm bringing her vegetable garden stakes inside and covering the rain barrel she kept on the south side of the house and making sure the shutters on the upper windows were secured. And she was on the porch roof trying to rehook the shutter latch that had worked itself loose when the first real gust hit and took her footing out from under her on the wet shingle. She did not fall. Lionel, who had come home early from Holt's ranch ahead of the weather and had seen her climbing onto the porch roof with the particular expression of concentrated determination he had already learned to identify as her most dangerous mood, was standing in the yard below and moved with a speed that surprised her, catching the edge of her skirt and then her arm with both hands as she scrambled for purchase. "I have it," she said, which was not entirely true. "I can see that," he said, which was also not entirely true. He guided her down, his hands at her waist for the last drop from the porch railing to the ground, and when her feet were on solid earth she stepped back immediately and straightened her apron with a brisk motion and said, "Thank you," in the precise tone she might have used if he had passed the salt at supper. But her heart was doing something complicated, and it was not entirely because of the near fall. He reached past her and rehung the shutter with a single practiced motion, the latch catching cleanly. Then the rain came down in full, a hard driving curtain of it, and they both ran for the back door and arrived on the porch breathless and dripping, laughing simultaneously at the sheer unreasonableness of the weather. They stood on the back porch together and watched the storm, and she did not suggest that he go inside, and he did not suggest it either. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his arm through his shirt, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled because what it contains is already more than enough. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time, and it meant something different than it had in the yard. "Any time, Miss Shelton," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name carefully, like he was aware of the weight of it, that she carried around with her for the rest of that evening. The weeks passed with the quality of good bread rising, slow and full. Lionel went to Holt's ranch by day and returned by evening. He ate her cooking and told her truthfully what he thought of it, which she appreciated more than extravagant praise. He borrowed 2 of her father's books from the shelf in the parlor, a history of the Mexican-American War and a novel she could not now recall, and he read them and returned them, and they talked about what was in them. He did not treat her as a figure in the background of a scene. He talked to her as a person who had thoughts worth hearing, which in 1878 in Dust Creek, New Mexico territory, was not a thing she had come to take for granted. She, in turn, found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day. While she was kneading bread dough, while she was balancing her accounts in the small ledger she kept behind the kitchen counter, while she was making his bed on the mornings when he left before she got to the rooms. His room always smelled of horses and tobacco and something else she could not name, something clean like cedar or rain. She stopped herself from thinking too specifically about this. She was a practical woman. She knew what it meant when you started noticing what a man's room smelled like, and she was not entirely certain she was prepared for what came after that knowing. Clarence Mott, the telegraph operator, noticed first. He had the observational habits of a man who spent his days listening to messages meant for other people, and he had sharp eyes under his round spectacles. He said nothing directly, which was tactful of him, but he began making small pointed remarks about the quality of the supper conversation on evenings when Lionel was present versus evenings when he was not, and he watched Beatrice's face when he did it with an expression of scientific curiosity. She ignored him with magnificent composure. What broke the careful equilibrium of that slow-rising thing between them was a market day in early September, and it arrived through no particular design of anyone involved. Once a month, a traveling merchant named Draper came through Dust Creek with a wagon of goods that were harder to find in the local dry goods store. Fabric, medicines, books, small luxuries and practical items alike. The whole town tended to turn out for it, which made market day a kind of informal social event overlaid on a commercial one. Beatrice always went, because there were things she needed for the boarding house that she ordered from Draper specifically, and she went early to get first choice of the yard goods. She was looking at a bolt of dark blue wool, turning the edge in the light to assess the weight of it, when Lionel appeared at her elbow. "Holt gave the hands the morning," he said by way of explanation, touching the brim of his hat. "Thought I'd see what the fuss was about." "It's not much of a fuss," she said, but she was pleased he was there, and she was busy noticing that she was pleased, which took a portion of her attention. They walked through the market together without precisely deciding to, which was its own kind of deciding. He was curious about everything in the way of a man who had spent most of his adult life on the move, and had not often had occasion to browse. He asked Draper about the origin of a particular hunting knife, with the same concentrated interest he might have brought to any question worth asking. He picked up a small carved wooden box and turned it over in his hands, examining the joinery with evident appreciation. Then he stopped at a tray of items near the back of the wagon, small things that Draper carried in a flat wooden tray, hairpins and ribbons and combs, and the kind of small decorative items that had no practical purpose, but that most human beings desired in some quantity regardless. And Lionel Fletcher, who was not a demonstrative man, who had grown up on the Texas plains where sentiment was a luxury that the land rarely permitted, picked up a small hair comb made of tortoiseshell with a delicate spray of painted blue forget-me-nots along the top edge, and turned it over in his hands, and then looked at Beatrice for a long moment. She was examining a paper of needles and did not see him looking. He bought the comb. She did not see him buy it. That evening after supper, when the other boarders had dispersed and she was stacking plates in the kitchen, she heard his step in the hallway, which she had learned was slower than the others, and had a slight pause on the third step from the bottom of the staircase, because of an old injury to his right knee that he had mentioned only once and without complaint. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and she turned from the dishpan. He was holding the comb. "I picked this up at the market," he said, and his voice was the careful kind it sometimes was when he was saying a thing that was harder to say than it appeared. "I thought it might suit you." She looked at the comb for a moment. It was pretty. It was the kind of thing that was entirely impractical and entirely lovely, and the blue flowers on it were exactly the color of the curtains her mother had had at the windows back in Missouri, which she had not thought about in years, and the fact that it was both pretty and useless was precisely the thing that made it a gift and not a transaction. She looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at him. And then she picked up the comb, turned it over in her own hands once, feeling the cool smoothness of it, the lightness, the delicacy, and she held it out to him. "I can't accept this," she said. He blinked. It was a small blink, quickly controlled, but she saw it. "It's just a comb," he said. "It isn't just a comb," she said, and her voice was level but not unkind. "You know it isn't, and so do I, and I don't want you to give me something this way, without us having spoken plainly first. I don't think you're the kind of man who means it as nothing, and I'm not the kind of woman who can receive it as nothing, and so we'd better say what things actually are before you put a gift in my hand." He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been cataloging for weeks without admitting to herself that she was doing it, and something in his face shifted, some last careful guard that he had kept up against the possibility of being wrong about what was between them. He took the comb back from her hand. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, warm and slightly rough, and she kept her eyes on his face. "All right," he said. "Plain speaking, then." "Please," she said. He was quiet for a moment that stretched to the edge of patience, and then he said, "I haven't looked forward to a place to come back to since I was 18 years old. I haven't sat at a table and felt like the conversation around it was worth having since I can't clearly remember when. I haven't thought about a woman the way I've been thinking about you, where it doesn't go away just because I've got other things to attend to. And I don't know what the right word for that is, or the right way to put it, but you asked for plain speaking, and that is it, plain as I can make it." She was quiet for a moment that was somewhat shorter than his. "I have been telling myself," she said, "that there are sensible reasons why a woman who has built a life for herself on her own does not rearrange things for a man who has been here 3 weeks. 5 weeks, he said. She almost smiled. 5 weeks, and there are sensible reasons, but I have also been telling myself that it would be foolish to pretend that those reasons are the only things I have been thinking about." He looked at her for another long moment, and then very slowly, with the same precision he brought to all things, he reached out and held the comb up between them. "Then maybe," he said, "you might like to accept this after all." She took it from him, this time without hesitation, and she set it on the counter beside the dish pan, and she turned back to him and said, "I think we ought to take this slowly." "I have nowhere pressing to be," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and the kitchen felt different after it, warmer and fuller. In the weeks that followed, they moved into something that was not yet formally defined but was understood by both of them and, increasingly, by everyone in Dust Creek who had eyes. He began taking supper slightly slower on evenings when the other boarders dispersed early, so there was time for the conversation to run its natural course. She began making his biscuits with extra honey, because she had noticed he preferred them that way, which was the kind of information she filed, without acknowledging the significance of having collected it. He asked her, on a Sunday afternoon in late September, if she would like to ride out with him to see the view from the top of the mesa that everyone in town referenced but that she had never actually climbed, having always been too occupied. She said yes with less hesitation than she had expected of herself. She had a horse, a sturdy gray mare named Marble that she used for occasional errands, and that was reliable if not particularly fast. They rode out in the long golden light of a September afternoon, past the edge of town, past the dry wash that Holt's land began beyond, and up the switchback trail that climbed the face of the red rock mesa, until they reached the top and the world fell away on all sides in a panorama of rusted earth and distant blue mountains, and a sky so enormous it made conversation temporarily impossible. They sat there for a long time, their horses ground-hitched behind them, and they talked about things that mattered. He told her more about the years on the cattle drives, the loneliness of them, and also the particular strange freedom, the way a man could go weeks without seeing a settlement and feel both enlarged and diminished by it. She told him about the years after her father died, the first winter alone in the boarding house, how she had woken at 3 in the morning certain she would not make it to spring, and then had gotten up and started the stove and made coffee, and decided that certainty was a luxury she could not afford. "You're the most self-sufficient person I have ever met," he said, and there was admiration in it but also something quieter, something that might have been wondering. "I had to be," she said simply. "There was no one else to be it." "There could be," he said, and it was careful and not casual, and she heard it for what it was. "Lionel," she said, using his given name for perhaps the third time because she had been careful with it, aware that names were their own kind of intimacy. "Do you know what you're saying when you say that?" "I believe I do," he said. "We've known each other less than 2 months. I'm aware of that. Men in your position move on when the work moves on." He turned to look at her directly, the way he always did, without any of the avoidance that lesser honesty might have required. "I've been moving on since I was 18. I'm 31 now. That's 13 years of it, and I'm telling you that I know what it feels like to leave a place and feel nothing particular about it, and this doesn't feel like that." She was quiet for a while, the wind moving through her hair, the mesa stretched around them in all its ancient, indifferent grandeur. Below Dusk Creek was a small cluster of shapes against the desert floor, and from up here it was possible to see its smallness and also to understand that smallness was not the same as insignificance. "I'm not going to fall in love hastily," she said at last. "I'm not built for it. I do things thoroughly or I don't do them." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want it any other way." "Then we should give this time," she said, "and see what it is when it's been through something." He nodded. "That's fair." She looked at him and he looked back, and the sun going down behind the mountains turned the rock around them every shade of orange and rose and copper, and she thought to herself, in the most private and unguarded part of her mind, that she was already considerably further down this road than she had officially admitted. October came in cooler and more merciful than September, and the boarding house filled up somewhat, 3 new boarders arriving within a week of each other, as the mining operations in the hills pushed more men down to the valley for supply runs and communication. Beatrice was busier than she had been in months, which was good for the accounts, and left her less time than she would have wished for the kind of long evening conversations that had become the part of the day she looked forward to most. Lionel was busy as well. The herd Holt had been acquiring arrived in stages through October, and Lionel was riding hard to manage the integration of the new animals with Holt's existing stock, the sort of sustained, complicated work that a man could sink into completely. He came to supper tired and smelling of cattle and leather and sun-dried grass, and he ate steadily, and told her whatever was interesting from the day, and she told him what was interesting from hers, and the shape of that exchange felt to her like something that had always existed, and that she was only now discovering. He brought her a jar of wild honey on a Thursday in October. He set it on the kitchen counter before breakfast without ceremony, with a small piece of paper folded under it that said only, "For the biscuits," in his angular, self-taught handwriting. She used the honey. She did not make any comment about it at breakfast. But when he came in that evening, she had a jar of her pudding up apple jam that she pressed into his hands with the same absence of ceremony, and she said, "For your breakfast on the trail," because he often took an early meal from his saddlebag rather than returning to the boarding house at midday. He looked at the jam and then at her, and the corner of his mouth curved up very slightly, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Shelton." And the way he said it was warm and layered and more than the words. They were building something, trading small things back and forth, small honest things, and every exchange was a brick placed carefully, and the structure of it was growing in ways neither of them spoke aloud but both of them felt plainly. November brought the first real cold, and with it, a situation that introduced a new kind of complication. A man named Rufus Tate arrived in Dust Creek on a gray morning, with a letter of introduction from a cattle broker in Santa Fe, and a very high opinion of himself that was not precisely supported by available evidence. He was 40, heavyset, with an expensive hat, and a habit of talking about money in a way that made it clear he believed money to be the final and sufficient argument for any position. He booked a room at the boarding house because it was the only option in town, and he made clear within 24 hours that he found Beatrice Shelton to be precisely the kind of woman he had been considering acquiring in the same efficient manner with which he considered acquiring other assets. He brought her a paper-wrapped bundle of calico fabric on his second evening, presenting it across the supper table in front of all the other boarders with the self-satisfied air of a man conferring a significant favor. "For your trouble," he said. "A woman running a place like this deserves something nice." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when everyone is watching carefully and pretending not to. Beatrice looked at the bundle for a moment. She looked at Tate. She picked up the bundle, set it back down on the table in front of him with precision, and said, "I appreciate the thought, but I make it a rule not to accept gifts from boarders. It complicates things." Tate looked momentarily nonplussed and then recovered his self-satisfaction with impressive speed, reframing this in his own mind clearly as a temporary setback. From the far end of the table, Lionel said nothing. He ate his supper, but she saw his eyes, and they were the carefully quiet kind that were not, in fact, quiet at all. After supper, when the kitchen was clean and the house had gone to its evening routines, she found him on the back porch in the cold air, smoking a cigarette, which he did rarely and always outside. She came out and stood beside him, and they looked at the stars for a moment. "Complicated things, does it?" he said, very mildly. "He is not a man worth complicating anything over," she said. He drew on the cigarette and let the smoke out slowly. "No," he agreed, "he is not, Lionel. The rule I quoted is one I invented on the spot." He looked at her sidelong in the dark, and his expression was that particular thing that happened on his face when he was trying not to smile and trying fairly hard. "I see. I thought you should know that. I appreciate you telling me," he said. "Good night," she said, and went back inside, and the cold night air she left behind her felt, she thought with satisfaction, quite usefully informative. Tate stayed 5 days, conducted his business with Holt, and left. He attempted twice more to present Beatrice with small gifts or invitations, and she declined both with a directness that was so total and devoid of softening that even a man of his self-regard could not misread it. On his last morning, he said at breakfast that it was a shame she was so set in her ways, and she said she thought being set in sensible ways was something most people ought to aspire to, and passed him the biscuits, and that was that. After he left, Clarence Mott said at supper that the quality of the air in the boarding house had measurably improved, and everyone at the table agreed, including Lionel, who said so without looking up from his plate but with a quiet satisfaction that she noticed and catalogued alongside everything else she was collecting about him. The courtship, if that was the word for the slow, careful architecture of it, deepened through November and into December as the cold settled in over the territory and made the world outside the boarding house feel more distant and the world inside it feel more immediate and close. He walked with her to church on Sundays, which began as a coincidence and then became a habit, and then became a thing the whole town observed and referenced obliquely in the cheerful way of small communities, where nothing significant goes uncommented upon. Reverend Parrish, who was a wiry and practical man who had built the leaning steepled church with his own hands, and whose theology was largely pragmatic, greeted them both on the steps each Sunday with equal warmth and a total absence of implication. She discovered in December that he could not sing. This happened at the church Christmas service when the congregation raised a hymn, and she, who had a perfectly adequate voice, became aware that from her left there was coming a sound that was technically in the same key as the hymn, but maintained that relationship through sheer determination rather than any natural aptitude. She glanced at him, and he was looking forward, singing with full, earnest commitment, entirely aware of his limitations and indifferent to them. She looked away quickly before she could smile in a way that would be inappropriate to the season. Outside after the service she said, very carefully, "I didn't know you sang." "I don't," he said with equal care, but it seemed called for. She laughed until she had to press her hand over her mouth, and he stood there with his hat in his hands and watched her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something warm and open and entirely unguarded, and it undid something in her chest that she was not sure she wanted undone quite so completely. He said quietly when she had recovered, "I like it when you laugh." She composed herself. "I like it when you sing," she said, "which is perhaps the most surprising thing I have discovered this year." "I have other surprises," he said. "I imagine you do," she said, and they walked back to the boarding house through the cold December air with their breath making small clouds, and the frozen ground crunching under their feet, and the whole world feeling, to her, like something that was very much and gloriously on the verge of becoming larger than it had been. Christmas in Dust Creek was a modest affair by any standard, the resources of a desert territory in 1878 not lending themselves to extravagance, but it had its warmth and its intentions, and Beatrice made an effort at the boarding house that was in some ways the most significant effort of her year. She decorated the parlor with pine boughs that Jimmy Driscoll brought down from the higher ground, and she made a Christmas dinner of roasted beef and sweet potatoes, and a dried apple cake that she considered one of her more reliable accomplishments. Several of the boarders had gone to family elsewhere, and so the Christmas dinner table was only Beatrice, Lionel, Clarence Mott, and old Mrs. Ada Whitmore, who had extended her stay considerably because she had fallen in with the rhythm of the boarding house and found that she missed it whenever she thought about leaving. The dinner was good, and the conversation around it was the kind that Christmas calls forth, full of memories and small philosophies, and the willingness to be a little more open than ordinarily seems necessary. After dinner, while Clarence and Mrs. Whitmore played cards in the parlor with the comfortable rivalry of people who have discovered that they enjoy each other's company, Beatrice sat at the kitchen table and did her accounts for the year, which was a habit she kept because it pleased her to know where things stood. She was partway through when Lionel came to the kitchen doorway. "Can I help?" he said. "With accounts," she said. "With whatever you need," he said simply. She looked at him in the kitchen doorway with the lamplight behind him and the winter dark, outside the window and the sounds of Clarence and Mrs. Whitmore arguing pleasantly about cards coming from the parlor, and she said, "Sit down, then." He sat at the table across from her, and she showed him the accounts ledger, not because she needed help with it, but because there was something she wanted to show him, something about how the boarding house worked and what it took and what it returned. And she found herself telling him about the debt she had cleared in the first year after her father's death, and the new roof she had saved for in the second year, and the way the accounts had steadily grown from desperate to manageable to genuinely stable. She told him about this with the pride of someone who has built the thing they are proud of themselves, from nothing, with their own hands and mind. He listened to all of it with complete attention, and when she was done he said, "This is no small thing what you've made here." "No," she agreed, "it is not. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have no interest in walking into something that someone else built and claiming any part of it. When I think about whatever might be between us, I think about it as something that would add to this, not take from it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Lionel," she said, "where is this going?" The question was direct, as all her questions were, and it landed in the kitchen with a weight that both of them felt. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and brought out the tortoiseshell comb, the one with the blue forget-me-nots, the one she had returned to him in this same kitchen 3 months ago. She looked at it and then at him. "I kept it," he said, "because you gave it back and told me we needed to speak plainly first, and we have been doing that, and I think we've been doing it long enough that I know what I want to say." She looked at the comb and felt the moment collecting itself around her. This kitchen that she had cooked 10,000 meals in, this house that she had held together through 3 winters alone, this man sitting across from her who had arrived on a tired horse and had not left and had, somewhere in the interval between then and now, become the thing she looked for in any room she entered. "Say it then," she said, and her voice was steady, which was something she was privately proud of. He stood up. He was tall standing, and the kitchen was not large, and he came around the table and stood in front of her, and she stood as well, because sitting down for something like this seemed insufficient to the occasion. He held the comb out to her. "Beatrice Shelton," he said, "I am not a man who has many words for the things that matter to him, but I know that I want to come back to this house every evening for the rest of my life. I know that I want to sit at this table, and I want to hear whatever you think about everything, because you think about everything more clearly than anyone I have ever met. I know that I would very much like to be the person standing next to you when things are hard and when they are not hard, and I would like that to be an arrangement we make formal and permanent. I am asking you to marry me." She looked at the comb. She looked at him. She took the comb. "Yes," she said, and it came out very quietly, not from uncertainty but from the depth of it, from the place where the things that matter most tend to reside below the register of ordinary speech. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and then his hand came up to her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, gentle and warm and wondering, and she leaned into it slightly. A thing she had not done with any deliberate intention, and he stepped closer and kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that is both completely surprising and also feels like the conclusion of something that was always, from the first Tuesday in July, inevitably moving toward this particular moment in a December kitchen, while 2 old people argued about cards in the next room. When they separated, she still had the comb in her hand. She looked down at it, and then she looked up at him with the gap-toothed smile that she rarely deployed, but that, when she did, transformed her face into something that he would later, many years later, tell their children was the reason he had known beyond any rational doubt that he was in the right place for the first time in his life. "You kept this," she said, "for 3 months. "I did," he said. "That is either very patient or very stubborn," she said. "I prefer patient," he said. "I know you do," she said, and kissed him again, briefer this time, with intention and warmth and the very clear character of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. They told the others the following morning at breakfast, which was Christmas morning, and the news was received with the sort of emotional extravagance that small communities tend to produce. Mrs. Ada Whitmore cried with open and shameless pleasure. Clarence Mott shook Lionel's hand with both of his, and said that he had been watching this particular development for 2 months with the interest of a man who believes in happy endings, and had not been disappointed. Jimmy Driscoll turned red to his ears and said congratulations with the earnestness of 19 years old encountering adult matters from a slight emotional distance. Patterson the miner said, "Good for you," and ate his biscuits. Beatrice served the Christmas breakfast with the same composure she brought to all breakfasts, but she was wearing the tortoiseshell comb in her hair for the first time, and everyone at the table noticed it. The practical matters of a wedding in Dust Creek in 1878 were not complicated by wealth or elaborate expectation. They set the date for the second week of February, which gave them 6 weeks to make arrangements, which were modest but heartfelt. Beatrice had a good dress, dark green wool that she had been saving without any specific occasion in mind, and she brought it to the seamstress in town, a woman named Rosa Espinosa who had nimble fingers and an artist's eye, and who added a lace collar and cuffs that elevated the whole thing considerably. Lionel had his good coat cleaned at the tailor's, which doubled as the laundry, and bought a new shirt of white cotton that he wore with his customary straightforward attention to the practicalities. Reverend Parrish performed the ceremony on a cold Saturday morning in February when the light came through the church windows at a low winter angle that filled the interior with a peculiar gold warmth. The whole of Dust Creek turned out, which was not a large number of people but was everyone, which is its own kind of significance. Ed Holt came, and he shook Lionel's hand outside the church afterward, and said he was glad to hear it because Lionel Fletcher was the best trail man he had employed in a decade, and he hoped he wasn't going to lose him over it. And Lionel said he didn't expect so, but that some things would need to change in terms of the hours, and Holt said he supposed they would, and both men nodded with the economy of understanding that practical people achieve. The thing that surprised Beatrice most about her own wedding, in retrospect, was how uncomplicated it felt. She had expected the ceremony to be freighted with the weight of all the years she had managed alone, the years that had accumulated like sediment and given her shape, and she had expected to feel the handing over of some portion of herself as a kind of loss. Instead, standing beside Lionel Fletcher in the leaning steepled church, while Reverend Parrish said the words that bound them, and the winter light made everything golden, she felt only the clean and uncluttered sensation of something being resolved. She had asked him, the week before the wedding, whether he had thought carefully about what he was taking on. Not just her, but the house and the work of it, the endless round of cooking and washing and managing and doing. He had said that he had thought about it carefully and that he considered it without reservation the most fortunate situation of his life. She had said, "I want you to understand that I will not become a different woman because we are married. This house runs the way it runs for good reasons." "I know," he said. "That is not a problem. And I will need to know that you talk to me when things are difficult, not just when they are easy." "I understand that," he said. "I will need the same." She had nodded, satisfied. And they had proceeded on that basis of clear and mutual comprehension, which was, she had always believed, the only solid foundation anything could be built upon. The wedding night was private and need not be reported in its detail, but what can be said is that they were kind to each other, and that kindness is the most intimate thing that two people can offer, and that it was the beginning of a pattern that held. Life at the boarding house after the wedding incorporated Lionel Fletcher fully and without disruption, which was something of a surprise to the neighbors who expected the domestic arrangements to require significant readjustment. In fact, they fit together with the ease of two pieces of something that had always been designed to join. He took over the heavier maintenance work without any discussion, the ongoing repair of fences and water pipes, and structural complaints that any building in the desert climate generated in quantity. He was handy in a self-taught way that was entirely adequate and occasionally inventive. She continued to run the cooking and the management and the accounts because she was better at it and because she wanted to. He negotiated a better arrangement with Holt, working a modified schedule that kept his hours more predictable and brought him home by suppertime with few exceptions. Holt grumbled somewhat and then accepted it because Lionel Fletcher was genuinely irreplaceable and Holt knew it, which gave Lionel a negotiating position that he used quietly and effectively. The spring of 1879 brought new business to the boarding house, as the territory continued its complicated and often unjust expansion. There were more miners coming through, more of the transient population that the silver boom in the mountains was generating. Beatrice managed this growth with her customary efficiency and began, for the first time, to think seriously about expanding the building, adding 2 rooms on the east side that would allow her to accommodate more guests and grow the income. She talked to Lionel about this at length, not because she needed his permission, but because she valued his thinking. He was a man who understood construction, having built fence lines and outbuildings across 4 years of ranch work, and he looked at her sketch plans with the same concentrated interest he brought to everything, and said that the East Side addition was sound, and that he thought they could do most of the framing work themselves over the summer, which would reduce the cost considerably. They did exactly that, working together through the June and July heat, and it was during those weeks of shared physical labor, building something together from raw lumber and intention, that the marriage became, she thought, fully itself. There was a particular quality to working alongside someone, a trust that developed from the daily evidence of competence and reliability, and by the time the 2 new rooms were framed and planked and roofed in late August of 1879, she understood that whatever she had built alone for the 3 years before this, what she was building now was of an entirely different and more durable quality. In September of 1879, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, after supper, after the boarders had dispersed, because the kitchen was where they told each other the things that mattered. He had been washing his hands at the basin, and he turned and looked at her, and she said it simply and directly, as she said all things. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was the full kind, the kind that contains more than words can and does not need supplementing. "Are you well?" he said, into her hair. "Perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise perfectly well." "Good," he said, and held her for another moment that was entirely sufficient to its purpose. The winter of 1879 and into 1880 was a period of genuine contentment, which is a quiet and underrated thing, contentment, because it does not arrive with fanfare or announce itself with drama. It simply settles in like good weather and makes everything easier and warmer and more possible. Beatrice ran the boarding house at what was now close to full capacity, with 6 rooms occupied most weeks, and she managed this while growing steadily rounder through the winter months with a matter-of-fact competence that impressed most of the women in Dust Creek who came to call, because she did not slow down appreciably, and she did not invite commentary about it. Mrs. Whitmore, who had by now made the boarding house her permanent home, and had graduated from paying boarder to something more like resident family, was the person she talked to about the practical aspects of expecting. And Mrs. Whitmore, who had had 3 children of her own and seen most outcomes, was calm and sensible and useful. Lionel worried, which was something he did not express dramatically but which Beatrice detected in the small adjustments he made, the way he was always there when she needed something heavy carried, the way he checked the stove every night before bed to make sure it was banked properly against the cold, the way he told her, on mornings when the tiredness was plainest on her face, that the boarding house would survive without her for a morning if she wanted to rest. She rarely rested, but she appreciated that he offered. Their son was born in April of 1880, a healthy and considerably vocal boy who arrived on a Tuesday morning with the same timing as his father's original arrival in Dust Creek, a fact that was noted with amusement. They named him Emmett for her father, and Fletcher as his surname, which was by then her surname too, and the name settled around the baby as naturally as everything else did. Emmett Fletcher was from the beginning an easy child in the broad sense, which is to say he was healthy and good-natured and capable of sleeping, and Beatrice managed the particular physics of running a boarding house with a new baby with the same organized intelligence she brought to all challenges, though she was the first to admit that the first 3 months required a recalibration of what she considered adequate sleep. Lionel took the night waking with a consistency and willingness that she had not expected to depend on as fully as she came to, and this was one of the things she added to the list of things she knew about him that mattered. The boarding house expanded again in 1881, 2 more rooms on the second floor and a covered porch on the south side. And by 1882, it was the largest establishment of its kind between Santa Fe and the county seat, which was an achievement that required noting. Little Emmett grew from infancy into a small, determined person who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's single-minded approach to all goals and objectives. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 13 and asking questions at 14 that were occasionally more searching than anyone present was prepared for. He adored his father with the particular devotion of a boy who has a father worth adoring, following him around the yard when Lionel was doing maintenance work, handing him tools with great seriousness, and listening with immense gravity to explanations of how hinges worked and why water moved the way it did. He adored his mother differently, with the slightly complicated devotion of a person who is profoundly safe in someone's care and therefore free to challenge the limits of it. He tested her patience with the creativity of a child who is intelligent enough to find new approaches, and she managed this with a mixture of firm clarity and genuine humor that balanced his nature well. By 1883, when Beatrice discovered she was expecting their second child, the boarding house was a fully realized institution in Dust Creek, known throughout the county as the best-run lodging between 4 named locations, and Beatrice Fletcher, as she was now known, had built it into something that her father would have looked at with the kind of quiet and total pride that exceeds any word for it. The second pregnancy she found somewhat harder than the first, though not alarming, and Lionel's worry was quieter and steadier, and she let herself lean into it more than she had the first time, because she had learned by then that leaning into what was offered by someone you trusted was not weakness, but its own kind of wisdom. Their second child was born in January of 1884, a girl this time, born in a cold snap with a good set of lungs and her grandmother's chestnut hair already showing dark and fine. They named her Clara, for no one in particular and for the sound of it, which suited her from the first moment. The family of 4 that existed in the boarding house by the spring of 1884 was a thing of its own particular texture and quality. Emmett, 4 years old now, had opinions about everything and shared them freely. Clara was a quieter temperament from the start, observant and watchful in the way that some children are, the ones who collect information before deploying it. Lionel Fletcher, who had spent 13 years moving from place to place carrying nothing that could not fit in a saddlebag, had become by gradual and complete transformation a man deeply rooted in a single place, and the roots were visible in him, the way deep roots always are, in the steadiness and the ease and the sense that this is not a temporary arrangement, but the permanent and chosen shape of a life. He had reduced his work at Holt's Ranch by 1884 to a part-time supervisory arrangement that suited both parties, because the boarding house, with its expansion and its reputation, now generated enough income that Beatrice could afford to pay for the heavier outside maintenance work, and there was enough to do within the house and grounds that Lionel was fully occupied without riding to Holt's land every day. Dust Creek changed around them in the way that western towns changed, sometimes forward, sometimes sideways, never entirely predictably. The silver boom in the mountains ran 3 years and then contracted sharply when one of the major veins played out, and the more transient element of the mining population moved on to the next rumor of silver somewhere to the north. This reduced the boarding house traffic for a season, and Beatrice looked at her accounts with the same clear eye she always brought to them and made adjustments without alarm, because she had built the house's finances with enough margin that a lean season was manageable. What replaced the mining trade over the following years was a different and more stable population. The territory was changing, becoming more settled, more permanent, and the people passing through Dust Creek increasingly included families moving west and settlers looking for land, and tradespeople responding to the growing domestic economy of a place that was slowly becoming less frontier and more community. The Shelton Fletcher boarding house, as it was informally known in the county, was a fixture in this changing landscape, and Beatrice adapted it to the changing clientele with the same intelligent flexibility that had always characterized her management. In the summer of 1885, she made the decision to serve dinner to non-boarding guests on Friday and Saturday evenings, which was essentially the creation of a small restaurant within the boarding house. And this innovation was so immediately successful that, within a month, she was fully occupied on those evenings, and had begun turning away people without reservations, a problem so pleasant in its nature that she addressed it by extending the dinner service to include Wednesdays as well. Lionel built new tables for the dining room and extended the covered porch to handle overflow seating, and Rosa Espinosa, the seamstress who had made Beatrice's wedding dress, sent her two nieces who needed employment, and both young women turned out to be quick learners who took to the work of waiting table with efficiency and eventually charm. The boarding house was not merely a business by this time. It was a place. It was the kind of place that a town grows up around, quietly and without announcement, the way a tree grows without any particular moment in which it becomes a tree rather than a sapling. People remembered things that had happened there. They sent their relatives there when those relatives passed through. Couples had their wedding dinners there. Deals were sealed over Beatrice's table, and old enemies discovered over it that they had more in common than they had supposed. One evening in September of 1886, Lionel found Beatrice sitting alone in the parlor after the last guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and she was sitting in the chair she always sat in with her ledger open on her lap but her eyes not on it, looking at the wall with an expression he had not seen on her face before. He sat down. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him. "I was thinking," she said, "about the first winter after my father died. I sat in this room alone at 2 in the morning, and I was certain I would not make it to spring." "I remember you telling me that," he said. "I want you to know," she said, and her voice was steady but had a quality he heard underneath it that he had come to recognize as the register at which she said the things she did not say often. "I want you to know that whatever I have built here, it is entirely different with you in it. Not because I could not have continued. I could have. But because what you brought was not something I knew I was missing until it was present, and now I understand why it mattered." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand, which was chapped from work as it always was, warm and strong and familiar. "I came to Dusk Creek on a tired horse," he said, "and I was 31 years old, and I had nothing in my life that was worth more than what I could carry, and I had been telling myself that was freedom. And then I sat at your table and you told me your rules with a sheet in your hands, and I thought, this woman knows exactly what she is and what she wants, and it's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen." She looked at him. "You thought all that at the gate." "Most of it," he said. She laughed softly. "You said nothing." "I had just arrived," he said. "It seemed forward." She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the parlor of the boarding house that she had built and that they had made together, and outside the September night was cooling, and through the window the first stars were coming out above the mesa, and this was the shape of the life they had made, quiet and full and rooted, and it was more than enough. It was everything. Emmett Fletcher, now 6 years old and in possession of opinions that would have been remarkable in someone twice his age, had recently taken to accompanying his father around the property with a small notebook, in which he drew pictures of things that needed fixing. He could not yet write the names of the things, but he drew them with a precision that was entirely recognizable, and Lionel had taken to actually consulting the notebook, which Emmett found deeply satisfying. Clara, 2 years old, was beginning to talk in full sentences that were grammatically incorrect but entirely clear in meaning, and she had developed a particular attachment to Colonel the cat, who was now of an age so venerable that his daily survival felt like a spiritual achievement. He had tolerated Emmett with a patrician disdain and appeared to have decided that Clara was acceptable, which Clara returned with such thorough affection that the old cat had taken to sleeping on her pillow. 1887 brought news from the territory legislature that was relevant to everyone in Dust Creek and to many people in the territory whose lives had been complicated by the legal and social structures of the time. There had been ongoing conversations in Santa Fe about land rights and property ownership, conversations that touched on the situation of the Mexican and Hispanic families who had held land under Spanish and Mexican grants before the American period, and who had spent the intervening decades fighting an often unjust legal system for what was rightfully theirs. Rosa Espinosa's family was among those who had lost land in this way, a story that Beatrice had known for years, and about which she had felt the quiet frustration of someone who understands an injustice but can see no mechanism for addressing it. When a legal advocate named Vargas came through Dust Creek in the spring of 1887, working to document and support the claims of families like the Espinosas, Beatrice offered him a room at no charge and the full use of the dining room for his meetings, which she thought was the minimum she could do, and said so when Rosa expressed gratitude. The work that Vargas and others like him were doing was slow, and the legal landscape was difficult, and the outcomes were uncertain, which was the nature of trying to correct old wrongs within systems that were themselves often part of the problem. But the attempt mattered, and the support for the attempt mattered, and Beatrice Fletcher's boarding house being a place where that support was offered was remembered in the community in a way that she did not seek and was not seeking, but that was a fact of what the place had become. Lionel said, when she told him she had given Vargas the room, "Of course you did," which was the entirety of his response and was sufficient and accurate. By 1888, Emmett was 8 and in school, where his teacher, a determined young woman named Miss Carver, who was the niece of the saloon owner, said he was either the most interesting or the most challenging student she had ever encountered, and she said this with enough affection that it was clear she did not consider it a problem. Clara was 4 and increasingly verbal and increasingly interested in accompanying Beatrice into the kitchen, where she stood on a small step stool and was given tasks appropriate to her size and enthusiasm. In the summer of 1888, Beatrice discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time, at 36 years old, which was not unusual for the time but which prompted Lionel to take on an expression of quiet and sustained attention that did not leave his face for approximately 4 months. She found this both touching and mildly exasperating, and told him so with her customary directness, and he said he understood but could not help it, and she said she supposed that was fair, and the matter was thus settled on terms that were honest if not fully resolved. The 3rd child, born in March of 1889, was another boy, and they named him James, for no particular reason except that it suited him immediately, which was the best reason. James was from his first days a tranquil and sunny child, which was a personality type that had not appeared in the family before, and which was welcomed by all parties with something approaching relief, given the intensity of his siblings. He had Lionel's dark eyes and Beatrice's gap-toothed smile, which did not appear at first but made its presence known by the end of his first year, and when it did it produced the same effect on everyone who saw it that it produced when its source smiled, which was to say that rooms felt warmer and people felt better. New Mexico Territory moved through the late 1880s with the particular mixture of energy and instability that characterized its time, pushing toward the statehood that would eventually come in 1912, 3 decades and more away, but already visible in the increasing permanence of its institutions and the growing complexity of its community. Dust Creek was not a boom town and was not a ghost town, and was therefore in the category of towns that survive by being genuinely necessary to the people who live in and around them, and the Shelton Fletcher boarding house was, by any assessment, one of the things that made it so. The children grew as children do, which is to say constantly, and in ways that are simultaneously expected and astonishing. Emmett at 10 was reading everything he could find and had decided he wanted to study law, which Beatrice thought was entirely plausible, and Lionel thought was ambitious and fine, and that there was no reason it should not happen. They began setting aside a portion of the boarding house income for the children's education, which was a thing that had not been possible in their earlier years, but was possible now. Colonel the cat died in the winter of 1889, peacefully, and in his sleep on Clara's pillow, at an age that Rosa Espinosa calculated, from what Beatrice knew of the cat's history, to be somewhere in the vicinity of 18 or 19 years, which was a remarkable achievement for any creature. Clara was heartbroken in the complete and total way that 5-year-olds are heartbroken, and Beatrice let her be heartbroken without minimizing it, which was the right thing to do. And after a suitable interval, Lionel brought home a kitten from a litter at Holt's barn, a gray and white thing that Clara named General in an interesting parallel to her predecessor that no one quite understood but everyone accepted. Life continued in the way that good lives continue, which is not without difficulty, but with the resources to meet difficulty, which is the practical definition of prosperity. There were years when the boarding house was full and years when it was not. There were seasons of physical hardship, a drought in 1890 that made the vegetable garden nearly impossible, and water scarce enough that every drop required management. There was illness, a winter in 1891 when whooping cough moved through Dust Creek, and both Emmett and Clara caught it and were seriously ill for 3 terrible weeks, during which Beatrice and Lionel traded the night watch, and neither of them slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. And James, then 2, remained inexplicably healthy throughout, which Beatrice attributed to his fundamental sunniness, and which the doctor attributed to his not yet being in regular contact with other children. All 3 children recovered fully, and the spring that followed the illness felt, to Beatrice, like the particular beautiful quality of a spring that comes after something genuinely hard, where the green of things is not taken for granted. Through all of it, through the drought and the illness and the difficulties that life in that time and place generated without any malice but without any mercy either, there was the kitchen table. There was the late evening when the house was quiet and the children were in bed and the boarding house day had concluded, and there was the 2 of them sitting with a pot of coffee between them, telling each other the things that mattered. This had been the pattern from almost the beginning, from those first long evenings when they had been circling carefully around the space that was between them, and it had never changed its essential character. He still brought things, small things, without announcement, a handful of wildflowers picked from the roadside, a book from the traveling merchant that he thought she would find interesting, a piece of particularly good coffee purchased from a trader in Santa Fe when he was in the area for business. She still received these things now with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who is entirely certain of the spirit in which they are offered, and she still gave things in return: the jar of jam and its successors, a new kerchief for his coat pocket, a hat she had ordered from the catalog when she noticed his old one had seen better years, and the giving and receiving was by now so much a part of the grammar of them that neither remarked on it except occasionally to smile. The comb lived on her dressing table. She wore it not always but regularly, on occasions that called for something a little more than ordinary, and whenever she put it in her hair she thought for a moment about the kitchen in December, and the lamp on the table and the man across from her who had kept a hair comb for 3 months because she had told him that plain speaking ought to precede gift-giving, and she had been right about that, and he had understood that she was right, and that was the thing, the essential thing, that had made all of it possible. On a morning in the summer of 1892, which was 14 years after Lionel Fletcher had ridden into Dust Creek on a tired sorrel horse and stopped at the gate of the boarding-house yard, Beatrice stood in the kitchen at 5:15, 15 minutes before breakfast needed to be served, and looked out the window at the yard. The garden was full in the summer morning, the kitchen garden that had been there when she inherited the house, and that had grown over the years into a sizable productive thing. Its green, a particular bright color in the early light. James was in the yard already, 3 years old and golden with the morning, crouching beside the tomato plants looking at a beetle with intense interest. Clara was helping General the cat navigate the fence rail with an expression of maternal concern that was entirely characteristic. Emmett had already left for school, striding out with his school books at 7:30, with the focused energy of a 12-year-old who had decided that education was a mission. Lionel came through the kitchen from the back stairs, tucking his shirt in, his hair still damp from the wash basin, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her looking out the window, and she heard him stop and turn to see him. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and crossed the kitchen to where she stood beside her and looked out at James and Clara and the cat and the garden and the wide blue New Mexico morning sky above it all. 14 years next month, she said. July, he agreed. You were 31 and I was 26. I know, he said. That was a long time ago. And not very long at all, he said, which was true in both directions and meant something different in each. She leaned against him slightly, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the kitchen where they had spoken plainly to each other on a summer evening in 1878, and where they had spent 14 years building a life that was specific and full and entirely theirs. "Emmett told me last night," she said, "that he intends to go to school in Santa Fe when he is old enough. He has decided the law is what he wants." "I know," Lionel said. "He told me too." In considerable detail. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "He has your stubbornness," Lionel said. "I merely provided the base coat." She laughed and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and then she straightened and turned to the stove because breakfast needed to be on the table at 5:30. The same as it always had been, the same as it would be, and the constancy of that was not a prison but a choice made and remade every morning in the same kitchen, where the most important choices of her life had been made. "Come to breakfast when it's ready," she said, with the mix of warmth and brisk practicality that was the specific music of her, the sound of her that he had known for 14 years, and that still, on any given morning, made him glad beyond any simple articulation of the word. "I always do," he said, and went out to collect James from the tomato plants, hoisting the small boy to his shoulders while James announced the beetle situation in detail and general. The cat walked importantly alongside, and Clara supervised the whole proceeding with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has decided the world runs better under her management. And in the kitchen, Beatrice Fletcher turned the biscuits in the oven and set the coffee on, and listened to her family in the yard and the boarding house waking up around her, all its rooms and its history, and its next morning full of people coming and going. And she thought, as she thought sometimes with a clarity that came quiet and complete like water finding its level, that of all the things she had built in this life, the most remarkable one had begun with a Tuesday afternoon and a gate latch, and a woman in an apron telling a stranger with dark eyes and a tired horse what the rules were. And the stranger had understood that the rules were not obstacles. The stranger had understood that they were the architecture of something worth building, and he had been right, and they had built it, and here it was, whole and warm and fully made, on a summer morning in Dust Creek, New Mexico territory in 1892, with biscuits in the oven and children in the yard, and the tortoiseshell comb with the blue forget-me-nots sitting on the dressing table upstairs, waiting for an occasion that was worth it. Every day was worth it, every single one.